to the afternoon session. This panel promises to be every bit as electric as the earlier ones, and in ways I think you might not imagine. I want to welcome the moderator, David McCraw, who is new to the center, has never been here before, and I hope this is the first of many such appearances. He has one of the most unknown and important jobs that you can imagine. And I'm not sure how to describe it, and he probably won't, but he is the Assistant General Counsel for the New York Times and Vice President there. So his job is to tell them, in other words, what they can do and what they can't do, and to think about things from libel all the way to the issues surrounding leaks. And as you know from reading the New York Times and other papers for the past 2 years, from the WikiLeaks scandal to other issues, there have been numerous occasions in which he's probably spent a number of sleepless nights. So, and I think you're going to very much enjoy him in this panel. So join me in welcoming the panel and David McCraw.
Thanks, Karen. Anybody who works for the New York Times knows that my job should not be involved telling people what to do. I try. On the panel today, delighted to have David Posen on the far left, ironically, no, on the far left, Associate Professor at Columbia University Law School, former Special Advisor to the State Department. Scott Horton is seated next to him. Scott is Legal Affairs and National Security contributor to Harper's Magazine, adjunct faculty member at Columbia Law School, one of the people who writes a great deal about this area. And next to me, Scott Shane is a national security reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. I've been told that I'm supposed to interrupt everybody. No one's been told to interrupt me, so I'll say a couple minutes and then move on. But I'm looking forward to trying to move this conversation along and address what I think is certainly from my side of the aisle an interesting issue, which is how does this play out when there's information that's classified that ends up in the hands of the press, or the legal paradigms that should govern that. How does it work as a practical matter in the real world? I come at this issue in a variety of ways. I currently am litigating on behalf of the New York Times the FOIA suit to obtain what we believe actually exists, although the government denies or refuses to say, that is the legal memos underlying the drone strikes. And so my colleagues from the ACLU have a similar lawsuit are here today as well. But probably the way that I most poignantly was involved in this issue was with WikiLeaks. And on June 23rd, 2010, I received a call from Bill Keller's secretary to come to a meeting that was about to take place. I was at the oral surgeon bleeding heavily at Gosnell. I explained to her that the oral surgeon hadn't gone well and I had a big bloody gauze in my mouth and maybe I could come later. And she said, no, you want to come now. So I came and I continued to bleed for the rest of the day. Nothing helped me at that meeting. The meeting was around the idea that we were going to get copies of the first set of WikiLeaks cables. Over the next month, leading up to July 25th, 2010, when the Times published the first set of WikiLeaks documents, you can imagine that from my perspective, as well as from the journalist's perspective, it was an incredibly busy time. I tried to understand, didn't really succeed, the Espionage Act. I tried to understand liability. I tried to understand what the exceptions could be found in the law, what the Pentagon Papers taught, what all those cases came to mean. And it was fairly momentous on July 25th when we first released those. And as a lawyer, you have the sense, well, what happens now? There's been no prior restraint. We were pretty confident about that. But what happens now? What's going to be the consequence of this for press law, for liability, for national security? And what happened after July 25th is exactly what usually happens in these situations. I got invited to be on panels all over the world to talk about the issue. That was about it. We never heard from the government. And what I found was that WikiLeaks really became sort of an ink blot test, a Rorschach test of what you cared about, as I went around and talked about it. When I was in China, professor in China raised the question, and after I talked about how the New York Times has been very careful in publishing these, concerned about not harming national security, not identifying, not exposing confidential informants and others who had helped the U.S. government or allies in Afghanistan. And this Chinese professor raised his hand and said, well, did you call the Taliban to find out what revealed their secrets? If you're really an independent medium, why are you taking sides? I acted like I didn't know what the translator had said. I didn't understand that question. When I got to Hungary, the first question, and Hungary, a country that understands about secrecy and understands the abuse that can be done in the name of secrecy and government security, first question was, do you think the U.S. Congress will change FOIA? Now they see how valuable this information is that will become available. I think it's safe to say that was not the first instinct of Congress to change FOIA. But I was happy when I got back to the U.S. and was on a panel with a prosecutor, former prosecutor, who said, well, can't we agree that it would be a really good thing for the New York Times to be indicted so we can clarify the espionage act? No, we can't agree. With that, it's given me an opportunity to think a lot about these issues. And you go back to the Pentagon Papers, Alexander Bickel, the lawyer at the Times and Yale law professor, talked about what he saw as a disorderly situation. The government should have broad powers to keep secrets. But once those secrets cross over to the press should have broad freedom to publish it. You refer to that as a disorderly situation, not an ideal situation, not a perfect situation, but a situation that worked. And I think that part of that was also sort of an implicit bargain that on the government side, prosecutions, leakers, prosecutions, and publishers would be exceedingly rare, and on the press side that there would be responsibility, if you will, that there would be consideration. And you now see that I think some of that bargain appears to be breaking down, at least that's what I want to address with the panel, that you now have 6 prosecutions of leakers in the Obama administration after three prior prosecutions. You now have a press that is not just the New York Times, not just the Washington Post, but WikiLeaks. The individuals no longer needing the mainstream media to put documents, formally classified documents, into the public environment. So it's a changing landscape on both sides. Different kind of media, I think a different attitude in government, or at least that's what it appears to us, the rise of concerns about terrorism and concerns for government secrecy, and the ability to transfer a large amount of data electronically. If you think back to the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg has to come to the New York Times or a paper like the New York Times to get the secrets out, and that was the only way to make them public, not so now. When the government wanted to do terrible things to Daniel Ellsberg, they actually had to send people to break into his psychiatrist's office. No longer necessary. The government now has other tools for doing this kind of thing. It seems very old-fashioned. But what I really wanted to start with the panel is ask, has things really changed? Are leaks a more serious threat now? Have the prosecutions shut off the flow of information to the public? Is it time to give more legal protection to leakers? It's time to clarify the Espionage Act. And should we revisit the scheme for classification? So have things changed? And if so, what should we do about it? And I'll start with, everybody has to be named David or Scott on this panel. I'll start with David.
Thanks. It's an honor to be here. And thanks to Karen and Sarah for having me to be on the panel with such distinguished Scots. So there's so much to say here that it's going to be tough to stay within time, or maybe it's just that I'm an academic now. But I think my charge is to kind of frame the conversation a bit with some more legal context. And his opening remarks, I thought I'd try to make 2 main points, or establish 2 main propositions to get us going. The first is just how remarkably rarely the laws against leaking have been enforced in this country, in light of what the laws permit and what political rhetoric might suggest. And the second point is that we can't understand this negligible enforcement rate without thinking about the ways in which the executive branch benefits from being leaky as a systemic practice. So first, on just how rare formal sanctions are against leakers, relative to the universe of potentially actionable leaks. It's already kind of been alluded to, but there have only been, by most people's count, 9 prosecutions of leakers to the media in U.S. history. I think that figure actually may be a little bit wrong, but it's roughly 9. Never, a journalist has never been prosecuted. Administrative sanctions might be thought to be a major backstop. They're a lot easier to bring to the government if criminal prosecutions are tough to bring. It's tough to know exactly what administrative practice has been in this area, but all evidence suggests that administrative formal sanctions against leakers are also very rare. There's a long line of government studies that have suggested that point. There are very few press reports of people being formally disciplined for leaking, notwithstanding that those press reports would have significant deterrent value for a government concerned to depress leaking rates, notwithstanding the media's interest in protecting its sources against reprisal, and notwithstanding the disciplined employee's interest in claiming whistleblower status. For all the reasons you might expect, more publicity around administrative sanctions of leakers if they had occurred. I've also submitted a bunch of FOIA requests for research I'm doing. Not all the returns are not in, but they too suggest that leakers throughout the U.S. government are very rarely formally punished. The second point is that there are a lot of leaks of classified information. I doubt I need to provide much foundation to that point to this audience, but a government report called the Willard Report, an interagency task force in 1982, called Classified Information Leaks a routine daily occurrence in Washington. So that the claim there is that they're daily. The WND Commission's public report in 2005 referred to hundreds of serious press leaks of classified information over the past decade alone. The third point is that, or piece of the argument is that most of these classified information leaks are potentially prosecutable. Here's the Willard Report again from 1982. In virtually all cases, the unauthorized disclosure of classified information potentially violates one or more federal statutes. The Espionage Act, which is the main statute involved, has a lot of ambiguities I won't rehash here, but generally you have to prove that the defendant knew his or her actions were unlawful, that the information was not already in the public domain, and in some circumstances you have to show potential damage to the national security from the disclosure. Courts have defined that term national security very broadly, by the way, to implicate most foreign relations information too. But given that the standard for classifying a document is anticipated damage to the national security, and that no court has ever accepted a defense of improper classification of a document, and that millions of federal employees sign non-disclosure agreements when they're read into classified programs, saying that they realize that disclosure of that classified information will damage the national security. It's actually quite hard to see why most disclosures of classified info aren't at least potentially prosecutable under the Espionage Act's main section. Moreover, there's not just the Espionage Act. There are a number of other statutes, criminal statutes, potentially applicable to leakers. Perhaps most notably, 18 U.S.C. 641 is the general theft and conversion statute. It criminalizes theft, conversion of property or other things of value of the U.S. government. Most circuits, although there's some split, read that to cover intangible information, including classified information, as well as tangible documents. So 641, at least in most of the country, seems like it could catch all classified information leaks and much more. And finally, the whistleblower laws are very little protection for defendants in these cases. In no circumstances do they authorize disclosure of classified information directly to the public. Steve Ladin, the audience, has written probingly on that. So you put all this together, all that I just said about the frequency of leaks and how they can be prosecuted and how rarely they are, you end up with a de minimis enforcement rate, at least on the criminal side. Gary Ross, a student of leaks, estimated recently that 0.3% of all potentially indictable classified information leaks do get indicted in U.S. history. That was using an extremely conservative estimate of what the universe of potentially prosecutable leaks is, basically ones that have been publicly acknowledged by the U.S. government to have occurred and been referred to the Justice Department. The real rate is probably close to zero. So even with the the recent uptick in leak prosecutions under this administration, while it's been branded a war against leakers by a lot of people, it's really more of a special operation. And just statistically, I think that point helps, it might help provide some context. There's still very, very rare enforcement. That's not to minimize the significance of what's happening. I think Scott Shane's going to talk about it, not to suggest it's not an important new development, but statistical perspective might be useful. So then a puzzle arises. Why is there so little enforcement against leakers, if I'm right about all that I just said? And time doesn't permit me a full answer here, but let me just say quickly, I think the standard reasons you hear are insufficient. So you hear two main things. The first thing you hear, and this came out in this first panel this morning, is it's just so difficult to catch leakers. I mean, they conceal their actions, they're operating in secrecy. That has some truth to it, I think, but it is unsatisfying on several levels. First, someone other than the leaker knows who leaked in almost every leak case, and that's the journalist. DOJ, however, has since 1970 had a very restrictive policy that is self-imposed. It's not constitutionally mandated, making it extremely difficult to subpoena a journalist. And this also came out this morning. It's only happened a few dozen times. Administrations have also foregone certain powerful investigatory tools to get at leakers. Ronald Reagan, famously or infamously in the early 1980s, proposed a systematic program of polygraphs for all suspected leak cases, and that every official who meets with the media in a context in which classified information could come up would have to give prior notice of that meeting and then write up a report and submit a memo afterwards about what was discussed. There was huge backlash, not only from the press, but from within the administration against those proposals. They've never been implemented. Polygraphs are used by some agencies in some circumstances, but they're not the norm. And finally, even notwithstanding the restrictions that have been put on its work, DOJ has had some success in catching leakers when they've been brought to DOJ's attention. We don't have much public data, but we know that from 2005 to 2009, DOJ initiated 26 investigations of leaks that were referred to from the intelligence community, and that it identified a suspect in 14 of the 26 cases. Now, there may be some selection bias there. I assume the FBI doesn't open investigations if it thinks they're bound to be quixotic, but still, 14 out of 26 is a decent success rate. That suggests many more leakers can be caught with the will within standard resource constraints. Quickly, I'll just say that the other thing you hear is it's so tough to bring these prosecutions. This came out this morning as well. National security might be put at risk by the very act of bringing these prosecutions if you need to disclose some classified information at trial. The Kruger case, or the defense tries to disclose such information for its defense. Well, one thing to say about that is, of course, the Classified Information Procedures Act was designed in 1980 specifically with these dilemmas in mind. It may not be perfect, but there's at least a burden on those who would say it's not working to show why. Moreover, if you bring a leak prosecution and the pretrial rulings by the judge augur poorly, either for your prosecution or for national security reasons, plea agreements do exist as a backstop. The Drake case that has already come up resulted in a relatively light conviction for Drake, and so it's widely described as a failure of prosecution of a leaker. But in terms of the actual experienced punishment for someone who is accused of being a leaker, as well as deterrent effect to other would-be leakers, it's still a powerful success for the government, even though a plea was all that was obtained. Moreover, there are other statutes, as I mentioned earlier, not just the Espionage Act, particularly the 641, the theft statute, which can be charged with less national security risk. There's even more evidence of a government not prioritizing enforcement against leakers, I would say. One is that only a fraction of classified information leaks ever get referred to DOJ. This has been alluded to in prior testimony by DOJ officials. Basically, the CIA and the NSA make some referrals. Almost no other component of the U.S. government ever does. If the SEPA or the Espionage Act are too clumsy, and that's a reason for not being able to bring successful cases, you would expect some White House to prioritize legislative reform. No White House ever has, although specific parts of the executive branch have made proposals over the years. In fact, President Clinton vetoed a major legislation in 2000 that would have strengthened the Espionage Act significantly. There's been no revisiting of the DOJ subpoena policy since 1970, even though that's a real handicap on DOJ investigators. And moreover, you might expect administrative enforcement to pick up some of the slack. It's all about how tough it is to bring cases. Okay, we'll shift enforcement to the administrative realm where we don't have to go in front of a judge publicly with our information, but as I suggested earlier, there's actually hardly ever any administrative sanctions against leakers. Here's what I'll just propose provocatively and quickly at the end, so I should give the floor, is that the missing piece in the discussion is that the executive branch benefits in various respects from a systematic practice of being permissive about leaks. That doesn't mean that certain particular leaks might not be destructive or worthy of our criticism on whatever grounds, but I'm talking here as a general practice. Very quickly, why might that be the case? One reason is that being permissive about leaks allows you to have a more robust ability to what some journalists call plant stories. If you want to make authorized disclosures, but informally, unattributed, of classified information from the White House, you can't be too vigorous in your crackdown on the unauthorized disclosures. Why is that? Imagine a world in which the executive branch very, very vigorously cracked down on non-White House authorized leaks. We would then become very cynical and very suspicious about every unattributed disclosure we saw in the newspaper, because we would expect, if it wasn't White House authorized, it would most often yield some kind of observable sanction, like a prosecution. This also gets to a puzzle raised by Marty in the previous panel, where Marty says it's all about not official acknowledgement. You know, the White House wants to plant stories so as to get information out there about what it's doing without officially acknowledging them. But Marty still raises the question: if everyone knows that all of these things you see in the newspaper are tantamount to official acknowledgement, then the whole game collapses, right? Unless people are almost silly in their level of formalism here. So how do you preserve that constructive ambiguity about whether this disclosure really is the U.S. Functional official acknowledgement or not? You have to allow some given system, some amount of unauthorized or quasi-unauthorized leaking. At least that's my claim. Very quickly, a few other factors. Most leaks that occur are not like Bradley Manning. They're not disclosures that are unauthorized in any sense of the term by a completely rogue, low-level actor. Most actually occur in this middle space between full presidential authorization and no authorization. They're by assistant secretaries at the State Department, Defense Department, people of relatively senior rank who are, it's ambiguous as to the extent to which they're authorized or not to implicitly or explicitly to speak with the press. Prosecutions of these officials, who I think are the majority of leakers, would expose the machinations of high-level government actors. They would make any administration look bad. They would upset agencies, and so on. And they would yield dubious national security benefits, because these are not, again, rogue actors who are striking out unilaterally. These are people who are deeply acculturated to the norms of executive branch practice. They have internalized some red lines they won't cross about stuff they're going to talk about. These are people who on multiple levels, are tough to prosecute. It's not clear that it's worth it. Finally, there's a big literature on leaks as a form of internal communication within the executive branch, how they allow you to bypass the awkwardness and the cumbersomeness of formal communication channels. A great quote from Secretary of State Haig during the Reagan administration. He said, by the end of the administration, we had converted the New York Times and the Washington Post into our White House bulletin boards. So leaks have dialogic, deliberative value within government for government officials. Leaks, I think, serve a strategic pre-commitment function. There's a lot of executive power scholarship recently that's emphasizing how if you want to be credible as an executive branch and sustaining power over time, you have to signal to the public that you're acting in law-abiding, responsible ways. How do you do that when you have such a bloated classification system? One way is through leakiness. If we all, as citizens, expect that basically anything really vile that the executive branch does will come out, because it's a leaky, at least like a sieve, as we all know, it actually, in some sense, increases our faith in the government in that it's not doing truly perfidious things. I think, finally, being leaky staves off more fundamental and painful reform. Similar to the last point I made, the executive branch is not forced to address the massive overclassification problem, in part because constituencies for transparency, including Congress and the media, feel adequately served by our leaky system that they're getting the info they need to learn. So in sum, I think the situation we have, well, David referred to it using Pickle's language famously as a disorderly situation, is actually a lot more rational than maybe it seems on its surface, and we should be skeptical of claims that this is some kind of a suicidal bind we've gotten ourselves into in the way we have so much leaking. The executive branch has, in many senses, blessed the status quo.
Hey, David, I would have cut you off sooner if I knew you were going to quote Alexander. But you just surprised me; it just came out of nowhere. Let me just follow up with one question, though, because you've managed to transform this into a nice discussion of the leaky situation. I want to go back to the prosecution. And I say this just to provoke questions about it, or thoughts about it. Isn't it a little bit like the study that showed that there were very few beating of slaves? And the conclusion was that slavery must have been a humane system because there weren't that many slaves who were beaten. But you don't have to beat every slave to have slaves conform to the master's will. Isn't it a few strategic prosecutions have a much wider range effect on the non-prosecuted?
It's an important question. The one response is that you might fear that whatever little observable sanctioning that happens is so thoroughly internalized by the actors within the system that you just don't need to bring that cases. That hypothesis is not consistent with the volume of leaks that seem to occur. People don't seem cowed, but I think it's right. I think I could give a long answer, but shortly I'll say, I think basically there's a two-stage or two-level enforcement system the executive branch has devised. Most leakers and most officials at a senior level are not realistically subject to criminal prosecution. They are therefore not going to be cowed, not deterred. They are, however, subject to informal sanction. There are a lot of stories and reports of people who are excluded, and interviews I've done to bear this out, who are excluded from meetings, they're not promoted, they're marginalized in various ways because they're seen to have leaked in the wrong sorts of respects. That's in senior official level. The lower level employees who the executive branch really does not want to be leaking at all are more realistically subject to hard sanctions, criminal or administrative. I think a lot of them, probably in the wake of what's happening now, are feeling a little more cowed. They are, and there's a sense in which this may be an optimal deterrent system for the executive branch if we can just very episodically and surgically go after Thomas Drake and chill a whole lot of people around him. I think that's plausible. What it doesn't speak to is the more senior level of government where at least I'm proposing much of the action occurs.
We'll come back to that, but Scott Horton, I could tell, was ready to jump in many places. The opportunity has come.
Maybe I'll just start with a bit of a plug. I think, we just heard, a great presentation that looks at the sociology of the situation, cuts through the official posturing to the realities of the way bureaucracies and political actors work, and puts an overlay of the law on top of that. If I had to give you some assigned reading for this function, I definitely assign an article that this man recently published in the Stanford Law Review called Deep Secrecy. I think it's one of the smartest, best recent works on the subject, so you should all go look it up. Now I'm going to try and make a case for a different framing of these issues. We're talking about leaks here. It sounds like a ship that isn't seaworthy somehow. I don't think that's really the issue we should be focused on. What we really need to address is the quality and nature of our democracy and what we expect in it. And I think, pulling back a little bit, we see in the interplay of secrecy concepts really a sort of power play. We see a realignment of political decision-making within our society in which people who have the super secret decoder ring, the highest level of national security classification, are the only people who have access to the vital information that enables them to participate in discussion and decisions about high-level national security matters. And that means, and I think that this is an increasing problem that has resulted in the space available for public discussion and public participation in those issues shrinking steadily. And this is something we need to be worried about. It's something quite fundamental. And in fact, we've had a few historical sites here, Khrushchev and I don't know, a couple of others. Well, you know, I think we need to go back to other models much further back. In fact, I think we need to go back to like the 4th and 5th centuries BC to Greece and look at how they viewed democracy. What was the essence of democracy? There's a fascinating fragment, a speech given by a philosopher named Protagoras, in which he gives a sort of creation myth. And this man now is being cited by philosophers of Greek history in the classical age as the prime expositor of Athenian democracy in the period. And he gives a creation myth for democracy. He says that humanity originally was scattered all over the place. It was victimized by forces of nature and wild beasts and by other human beings, and that humans had to assemble together in communities for their own security. So he says collective security is the essential reason for the state. Then he gives a myth involving, which is sort of a retelling of the Prometheus legend. I don't mean the one in the current motion picture, by the way, although it may not be a far-off semblance of it, in which he says Zeus, the god, decided to give gifts to humanity, and he arranged for these gifts to be distributed broadly amongst the entire population, because cities cannot be formed if only a few have these arts, he says. And he refers to this as the political technique or skill, and that is democratic dialogue, what we today know as democratic dialogue. The idea that you have skills, knowledge, spread diffusely amongst the population coming together, engaging in discussion, can come to the best solution and the best answers, principally for their own defense. And finally, he says that the city's going to prosper, the state's going to prosper, and if it's going to survive, it has to effectively form ways of pooling these resources and channeling them into correct decisions. And it's very, very clear throughout, he's thinking about national security as the principal thing that people are discussing. And in fact, we know through quite recent historical research that in prominent Greek democracies of this age, especially in Athens, when assemblies of people came together and they were discussing issues very frequently, they were discussing questions of war and peace, whether to go to war, whether to make peace, on what terms to make peace. And they were discussing deeply and profoundly questions of accountability of their own leaders who were engaged in national security decision-making. Did they exercise fair judgment? Did they do the right thing? And the public, as we know in that era, was a very, very harsh judge of these things. So I think this gives us a marker against which we can measure our own democracy that's really quite radically different. And I think in our day today, these accountability processes have really fallen apart. They've become extremely weak. That's approaching a crisis. Now, in fact, we have sort of a triangle, and the Greeks talked about this too: secrecy, privacy, and publicity. And every state has got these three different characteristics in different measures. And the way these three qualities are doled out and measured defines the nature of the state. So, for instance, we're told that in a state where the leaders are allowed to make decisions about the affairs of the state in secret, but the citizens, the ordinary citizens, have no privacy. They're always subject to intrusion by the leaders. That system is called a tyranny. And a democracy is defined as a state in which the affairs of the state are public, to be known by all and for all the people to participate in important decisions and resolutions, whereas the affairs of individual citizens are private and are shielded. I think these are, very, very powerful models. And I think we should look at how we have dealt and how we have reallocated the situation. We have a situation in the United States today where increasingly national security affairs are being privatized. The number of individuals who are allowed to participate in making those decisions is fewer and fewer, whereas the space for private individuals is no longer nearly so screened from intrusion by the state as was the case historically. And I think if we look at major questions that we have faced recently, we see the reflection of this process. So, for instance, I mean, things we've been discussing this morning, drones. And drone warfare is a process that's being dominated now by JSOC and by the CIA. It's covert warfare. Therefore, it seems to have been withdrawn from the table of matters that can be discussed even at a policy level in a meaningful way as a part of our political process and our democratic process. Secrecy is playing a very important role in that process. We also have matters like the war that was waged in Libya, which I think it marks some very, very disturbing precedents because we had no Oval Office speech being given by President Obama. We had no meaningful consultation of Congress. We had no public debate about it. Terrible precedent for us. And we're looking at possible conflicts in the future involving Iran and Syria, for instance, again, in which intelligence and the manipulation of intelligence by political figures plays a huge role. So we're talking about leaks, but I'm focused on having an informed public that can participate in a democratic discussion. And I don't think leaks is really the correct frame for it. But I think WikiLeaks, if we look back at it, it's, I think, proving to be a very, very useful example of the government's tendency to hype the dangers that result from disclosure of this information and to overstate the risks that result from this. I think we go back, we heard Secretary Gates' statement read in one of the earlier panels, which I think was an important statement. Actually, he also said that charges that those who had leaked the information had blood on their hands were hyperbole, he said, not true. I think Gates has this just right, but unfortunately the government as a whole was obsessed with this drumbeat of gloom and doom. And we go back and look at what happened with WikiLeaks. It's obviously a mixed bag. There are obviously cases where individuals were embarrassed by things that were disclosed. There may be some people who legitimately perceive a bit of a threat, but by and large, that's not the case. By and large, I think the public benefited from having this information put on the table. And by and large, I think the disclosure reaped more benefits than harms for the United States. And I say this based on discussions with a number of political figures abroad who tell me, as one head of state in Africa recently told me, he was shocked to see that, my God, this government really does care about corruption and really does care about transparency, and it was in all these cables, and they were actually acting up on the things that they were reflecting. So I think it did wonders for the U.S. reputation at the end of the day.
Scott, I obviously agree with much of what you said, but I wonder if you could come back to a question I have when that troubles me, and that is, as much as I like Scott Shane, as much as I trust my own judgment, nobody elected us to decide whether national security was going to be jeopardized. Isn't there something fundamentally wrong under a rule of law scenario where you're now taking those decisions out of government and putting them in private hands? You have Scott Shane and then the likes of Scott decide whether this is going to harm national security to reveal this secret or not.
No, I think it's problematic. And I think we have to start by acknowledging that every government does have legitimate secrecy claims and that government should try to maintain certain secrets, diplomatic secrets, military secrets are the obvious sorts, as discussed even in the first Congress. And the idea that individual citizens will make up their own mind the claim of secrecy is bogus, is problematic. However, we have thousands and thousands of cases historically now where we can show that, in fact, the claim of secrecy was bogus, and disclosures served legitimate democratic ends. So I think there's no easy solution to this. I think what we really have to, the fundamental problem we have right now is that we've constructed a system where there's no downside for claiming security classifications. And if we're ever going to get a handle on the problem of gross over-classification, it's got to be creating a new system in which there are risks to a civil servant making a decision to classify something that shouldn't be classified.
Scott Shane, the challenge has been thrown down. We started quoting Alexander Haig. We went to the Athenian philosophers. I don't know how you're going to raise the bar here, but I'm supposed to ask you how you feel. You can go from there on out.
I feel intimidated. I'm gonna have to bring us back from the 5th century BC to 2012. I guess the question I'd like to briefly raise is, I sort of agree with David Posen, and I disagree in a couple ways that I'll mention. But we have worked out over the decades a sort of jury-rigged system where the government relates to the press relates to the people, and we sort of chug along. And I'm wondering whether in two different ways we're undermining that system. One is with this proliferation of leak prosecutions. The other is with the rise of what I would call publicly classified information. So first let me go back and read something that a Washington Bureau colleague wrote, some of you may recognize this, about how journalism works in Washington. Without the use of, quote, secrets, unquote, putting in quotes because that's what the government calls these things, classified information. Without the use of secrets, there could be no adequate diplomatic, military, and political reporting of the kind our people take for granted, either abroad or in Washington. And there could be no mature system of communication between the government and the people. That was written in a brilliant affidavit in 1971 by Max Frankel, then the Washington Bureau Chief, later the editor of the New York Times. I quote it only to say that is absolutely true to this day. And this sort of weird system that we have where certain things are designated as secret, but we continue to write about them, I think has actually proven quite functional over the decades. And that's what I'm a little worried about, that this sort of strange consensus that operated for many years may be breaking down a little bit. I would not, and none of my colleagues would deny that there are legitimate secrets that need to be protected, and we sometimes take a lot of flack in the New York Times from bloggers and others who think that we are too kowtowed by the government. But it is generally our practice, if we have any kind of story, that we call, if it's about a government agency, call the agency, say, what about this, we're going to write this. And they have an opportunity to say, oh my God, the world will end if you print that. And then we kind of, listen to them and make a decision. And I found myself in the very peculiar situation when we were publishing the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables, these 250,000 diplomatic cables that we had gotten through WikiLeaks, of being the person who was assigned to actually redact the cables, in most cases to protect people who, I actually consulted with the State Department, and they would make the case that, this Chinese professor, this Russian dissident would be in grave danger if we named them. That all fell by the wayside because WikiLeaks eventually put all the cables out unexpurgated. And I would agree that the government's warnings about the dangers of that were, have by and large proven overblown. But let's look at Barack Obama and what I would consider his, he hasn't said much about this, but in a way, the administration's inconsistency on this subject. Everybody knows about enhanced interrogation techniques described by some as torture, as used by the CIA and the Bush administration at the so-called black sites. Everybody knows about the so-called warrantless wiretapping by the National Security Agency under the Bush administration. Both those were only brought to light by, quote, leaks, unquote. If somebody hadn't stuck his or her neck out, risked, in principle, prison to talk about those things. We might not know about them today. Barack Obama, of course, ran against certainly the enhanced interrogation techniques. He based a considerable portion of the national security component of his campaign on running against these programs that he knew about, we knew about, or he could talk about, only by virtue of leaks. So that makes it particularly ironic that there have been 6 cases, by most counts, double the number under all previous presidents. And that's what I think is beginning to potentially chill reporting, chill sources from talking to reporters, and sort of break down this system that we've been talking about. Long ago, I was in Moscow during the last years of Soviet power and the collapse of the Soviet system, and I later wrote a book, the premise of which was partly that excessive secrecy, dysfunctional secrecy, was one of the reasons that the Soviet Union was undermined. And we're not quite at that level, but it is amazing how often I have seen in recent years absolutely ridiculous examples of classification. Just to give you a couple of examples, there's a guy named Ali Safan, who was an FBI agent, one of the early FBI agents focused on Al-Qaeda, and he wrote a memoir last year called Black Flag, and the CIA and the FBI, as you know, have a kind of decades-long feud about just about everything. And the CIA got a hold of his book and decided that it needed to clear the manuscript, and took a lot of things out of the manuscript, the kind of things it took out. He is well known and had written publicly about being involved early on in questioning a guy named Abu Zubaydah, one of the first of the so-called high-value terrorists caught in 2002. And but that was considered to be secret, even though everybody knew about it. He had written op-eds about it, and by the CIA. So the CIA took out the personal pronouns from the chapter about Abu Zubaydah. So it says, instead of saying, I packed my suitcase when I got this phone call and headed out, it says, blank packed blank suitcase. So that's good. You actually paid, you, the taxpayer, paid someone to go through that book and take that stuff out. One other example that seems to be equally absurd, although it's less easy to understand, is that the CIA has triumphed over a guy named Jefferson Morley, who's been fighting in court for years to declassify records related to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You would think that by now, stuff that happened in 1963, the Cold War is over, most of the people involved back then are dead, that it might be safe to let out some of these secrets. But they have fought successfully in court to keep hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things secret that seem to bear at least an indirect relationship to the Kennedy assassination. It's kind of fascinating. I wonder what's in there myself. Finally, there is this category called that I call public but classified information. The drone strikes being a prime example. Cyber offense, cyber attacks are another one now that's sort of emerging as drone strikes did, as targeted killing did. And it's following a similar pattern. I think what you have is events that occur on the ground, such as stuff blowing up, people being killed, that you can't deny. So information comes out about it. But there are still these formal restrictions on who can say what. The very strange result of that is I can talk about drones. In fact, we can all talk about drones. Except for possibly David, because he was a government employee and may be restricted in what he says. Most significantly, Congress cannot talk publicly about drones. So you have this very strange situation where the U.S. has embarked on a perhaps good, perhaps bad, but certainly very important new kind, using this new kind of technology in a ethically and legally very dicey, disputed area. And no, there has never been a public debate in Congress on this. Ditto for offensive cyber attacks. We see Stuxnet. Stuxnet got reported. My colleague David Sanger wrote about that it was part of a wider range of programs called Olympic Games. But we have embarked again on a new technology in a very hazardous, in the view of many experts, area. We're setting a precedent for many other countries, both with drones and with cyber attacks. Congress has not been able to talk about any of that because it's classified. We can talk about it, they can't. So you have this strange breakdown of what would normally be the sort of functioning government in a democracy. The final thing I'll say is that we talk about leaks as endangering people, programs, government operations. It's very interesting to talk to Tom Kane, former governor of New Jersey, who was the chairman of the National 9/11 Commission who investigated 9/11 attacks. If you ask him what made us vulnerable to 9/11 11 years ago, was it leaks or was it secrecy? He'll tell you it was secrecy. It was excessive secrecy that made us vulnerable to the worst terrorist attack in American history. It was not leaks. If there had been more leaks, he would argue we would have had a far better chance of stopping this attack. So I think that's where the danger. David's absolutely right that 6 cases, as someone said earlier, 6 cases out of 300,000 criminal cases is not a lot, but they do have a very serious chilling effect, which I experience in my work every day. Sometimes when you call someone and you get a black humor response, like, oh yeah, I'm going to tell you about that, I'm going to end up like Tom Drake, who did not go to jail, ended up with community service, but in the meanwhile basically lost his house, went into bankruptcy and had his life turned upside down, and his career completely derailed. He was a high-level NSA official. He's now working at the Apple store in Bethesda. So that is a serious chilling effect, believe me, for the many people we talk to for our job. Thanks.
Scott, you managed to meet the challenge. David talked about it, quoted Alexander Haig. Scott quoted the Greek philosophers. You quoted your own book. That was really nice. Let me press back on this. Every time I raise this idea, whether leakers need more protection, whether the prosecutors are bad, the response I got from one Washington reporter was, leakers don't look up Pentagon papers and decide what the law says. They don't look up Morrison. They don't look up the APAC decision by Judge Ellis. They don't do that. They're motivated by other things. And you look at the New York Times over the last few days, leaks about Libya and so forth. Isn't David right that leaking continues on in a pace?
Yes, absolutely. And I wouldn't even call it leaking. I would just say that it's the normal business of government, explaining things to the press or through the press to the people. And leak always makes it sound like there's something illicit about it, whereas I think it's sort of the foundation of the way our country operates. But I have to say, and I think most of my colleagues would support this, there have been several instances where we and other reporters have made a determined effort to find out certain things. And 5 years ago, we think we might have been able to find it out. And now we've had real trouble. And I'll just give you one example. There's something called Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which probably everybody here knows since we're at a law school. It's the business records section of the Patriot Act. 5 senators, I believe, if I'm not miscounting, have made cryptic statements saying that this provision is being misused in a way that would alarm Americans and outrage Americans if they only knew how it was being used. I and many of my colleagues have sought to find out what the heck they're talking about, and we still don't know. I suppose maybe someone would say we shouldn't know because it's classified. But I have a feeling that it's very tantalizing when a senator says the public would be outraged if they knew what I know. and you're not able to find out, that's sort of impressive, and that's a little bit of a change in the atmosphere.
Scott Horton, let me go back to you, because Scott Shane made a point which reinforced a little bit what David said, which is that don't we know about the drones? Using that as an example, hasn't the system worked in the sociological way that David sketched out, that there have been significant leaks, and what is it that remains that would be known?
Well, readers of the New York Times know about the drones, I guess. I think we can say that. No, I think journalists have done their work in developing a lot of information about what our national security apparatus thinks, how it's motivated, and how it's acting. I think that's true. But what we have not had fundamental policy discussions in the country that we need to have. And I think we can define that along many different lines. But for me, the key issue is if we look at what's going on in Pakistan, for instance. We have the CIA engaged on a traditional in a traditional theater of war in what historically have been viewed as military tactics over a sustained period of many years involving hundreds of strikes with clear military objectives. And is that a correct use of an intelligence service? I think that's a very fundamental question. We've got the same issue with respect to Yemen, I think, right now, and potentially other places. So it is this, the CIA just growing outside of any reasonable interpretation of its original mandate from the time of its birth. That's a huge issue. The CIA has been astonishingly successful in keeping that caged in and not discussed. So there's a lot to be talked about. I think also the leak process itself has led to a bit of a distortion of the reporting. I mean, I think this is an area where your public editor did a very, very good job of reviewing the situation. That is, many publications in the U.S. are really focused on our national security apparatus and what it's doing, what it's thinking, how it evaluates things. So that's what there's tremendous effort put into ferreting that information out and reporting it. Well, there's a lot more to the story that's not being reported. And what's actually going on in the grounds, on the grounds in Pakistan are the claims that they make about efficacy of the strikes and the number of civilian dead correct claims, whether the broader consequences of this effort for U.S. relations with Pakistan. I mean, for instance, at the end of the day, we wind up killing several hundred terrorists and would-be terrorists with minor collateral damage, but we turn Pakistan, once defined as one of our closest non-NATO allies, into an irreconcilable enemy with nuclear weapons. That's not a success.
David, I don't know where you come out on the drone thing, but let me just pose it. It seems to me, as a person on litigating this issue, that the government wants to have it both ways. They want to talk over and over again about the drone strikes, but never tell us what they don't want us to know. And that doesn't the leak system fail? And you did a nice job painting it sociologically, but isn't that really the failure that the cards were held by the government?
Yeah, this goes to kind of what I was trying to get earlier about the necessary constructive ambiguity that the government wants in this area. If what you said is right, that the government wants to have it both ways, and the same people who are trying to deny these FOIA suits are the ones some concerted way leaking, then we have a real basis for cynicism. However, since leaks are not this monolithic phenomenon, we don't really know who's saying what. There's a lot of quasi-authorized talking. It's hard to really pin down that charge on the White House, since it's hard to say what they might have disclosed through leaks versus anyone else.
Why should we divide the government like that? Isn't it one side?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of the dark side of what Marty was, in a sense, celebrating, I think, in the last panel, which is the most principled justification for playing a game of talking in an unattributed, leaky way about the drone program while asserting the Glomar defense to these FOIA suits is the something about the special diplomatic currency of non-official acknowledgement. That puts it in the best light. The most negative light is that kind of disclosure allows the government to get all the upside without allowing domestic watchdog groups like ACLU to leverage the disclosure for details that matter to a lot of people about procedures, legal standards, collateral damage, and the like. I think somewhat complicating the question of, the normative question of whether this is good or bad or just or not is the counterfactual. In a world in which there wasn't this kind of quasi-authorized or authorized talking about drones, do we see, it's not necessarily a world of more frontal official acknowledgement in which we're having a more pristine, rich, democratic conversation about drones with more integrity. It might be a world in which there's no disclosure or far less disclosure about drones at all. So I find very vexed and kind of difficult these kind of high-level normative questions about is this good or bad for democracy, the system we have, and I have no sharp answers, but I think there are. I would agree with the proposition of the real cost to the system we have. Let me just say one other quick thing on whether it's good or bad. You also you mentioned earlier the common critique that who is Scott Shane in the New York Times to publish these secrets, this is an affront on democracy. We have elected leaders, and yet the New York Times or the individual leaker is talking about drones. I think what I was saying earlier provides a partial response, which is that rests on a very thin, implausible conception of democracy in the sense that our elected leaders have effectively blessed talking to Scott Shane about these things in their practices, if not in the laws they put on paper. No senior government official has ever been prosecuted for leaking. There's been almost zero disciplinary action. There hasn't even been much energy or resources invested in finding leakers, much less going after them. In light of that long-standing background, it's not crazy to think that the government has, in some practical sense, actually has kind of blessed the New York Times to play a certain role within.
Yeah, I guess the hard part I have is I agree with you at the sociological level, but there's no sociological defense for Karyakov. There's no sociological defense for Drake. Those guys can't come in and say, you're right, they can't come in and say, well, the big shots are doing it and it's good for society, but that's not a defense.
This is why you're legally vulnerable. But I will say the jury plays some role here, at least in Espionage Act prosecutions, in channeling. I gave a case for why, at least in technical terms, it's very hard to see why every classified information leak isn't prosecutable. One answer might be that the jury, notwithstanding what the laws say or the instructions they get from judges, has developed some kind of sense of hypocrisy and sense of fairness, and that the jury would be amenable to arguments in the spirit of, but you allow all this leaking to occur, how can you go after me? I think that it's sociological, but it gets filtered into the legal system through the jury as a real check here.
Of course, and then it concerns many of us on my side of the aisle that then the Southern District of New York decides to prosecute the guy who's advocating jury nullification to make sure that doesn't happen. But Scott, back to you. Public editor Wright, it's really our fault that this stuff is not out there. Your fault, not mine. It's not his fault.
Well, actually, for those of you who do not see a column on Sunday by our new public editor, kind of ombudsperson, Margaret Sullivan, she, sort of gently chided the New York Times for not doing enough coverage of drones and targeted killing, quoted some folks critically. I guess the one thing that I would say was to Scott is that he's absolutely right that most of our coverage has, has certainly been weighted towards, what do the people in Washington say about drone strikes? How do they make these decisions? As opposed to the poor folks in villages in Yemen and Pakistan. We see them coming down on their neighbors or on themselves. But that is not really related to, that's our, that's the inherent difficulty of doing that reporting. It's nothing to do with the fact it's classified. The classification certainly doesn't keep us from going to Pakistan and walking around the trial areas and asking a lot of questions. What does keep us from doing that is that the trial areas are a very hazardous place between the militants and the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence. Very difficult to travel around, and if you do, I haven't done it. If you do talk to people who try to do it, some Pakistani journalists try to do it. They often find that the people they're talking to, they are uncertain as to their reliability as eyewitnesses because they are sometimes intimidated by the militants, sometimes they're sympathetic to the militants, sometimes they're intimidated by the ISI, sometimes they're being paid by the ISI. So even if you do that reporting, it's very difficult. But I would certainly agree with both the public editor and Scott that we ought to do more of it.
If I could just respond quickly. I don't agree with your conclusion that secrecy doesn't help frame it. I mean, I think secrecy has played a key role in framing the issue in a very narrow way and avoiding the broader policy discussion. And I think without that broader policy discussion, there's also less interest in seeing the facts developed and the reporting developed. But I would give you a little bit of credit because I think while I think the public editor was right to say there's too much missing from the reporting, and still if you compare the New York Times with other U.S. Publications and broadcasters, the New York Times has actually offered more reporting out of Pakistan and about Pakistani affairs than most of its competitors. But it's still a huge issue that's being missed.
Scott Shane, isn't Bradley Manning WikiLeaks different? I mean, don't you feel a little uncomfortable with what is an indiscriminate, wholesale providing document, as opposed to the guy who's a Drake type situation? Drake sees something he doesn't like. He can't get any remedy within the system, and so he's accused of, and I guess he actually does. He makes that public, so the public can do something about it. That's not Bradley Manning. Shouldn't we feel differently about Bradley Manning than we do about the Thomas Drakes of the world?
Well, I mean, there are differences, and you just articulated them. But I think it was interesting that earlier, I think it was Ken Weinstein who made this distinction, which seemed to be, on behalf of the New York Times, because there is a continuing grand jury investigation of WikiLeaks, and presumably doing Assange and the other folks who have worked for WikiLeaks. If they actually brought a successful prosecution, it would be the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, that a non-government employee would be prosecuted successfully for disseminating classified information. So even though there is a distinction between the Tom Drakes and Bradley Mannings, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that there is a very clear-cut distinction for two reasons. One is I feel somewhat awkward saying, oh yeah, that Manning, he was completely irresponsible, and that Assange, he deserves what he gets, when I spent months writing stories based on the documents that they, in effect, stole and provided to the New York Times. So that would be somewhat two-faced of me, and I think of the New York Times to take that position. But the other thing is, I don't really see a difference in scale, maybe in motive, and so on. But I don't really see how we are, one could say that I spend a considerable amount of my time trying to find out classified information and make it public. And so if the Julian Assanges go off to the Huskow for that crime, I'm going to be looking over my shoulder. And so, I'm hoping that that doesn't happen.
Bill Keller once asked me whether the New York Times would sign on to an amicus brief on behalf of Julian Assange. He chose to do that while we were making a presentation to the board of directors of the New York Times Company. I sort of changed the subject, which I'm going to do right now. Do you buy into the premise of my question that Bradley Manning is a different in not only in quantity but in quality?
I definitely do. I mean, I think a government, just looked at from the perspective of the government and the executive branch, can tolerate some amount of, whether misguided or noble, discrete revelation by individual employees of perceived abuses or problems on the order of Thomas Drake. it can't tolerate, as a matter of just kind of internal governance, someone who's has a much more subversive aim of condemning the whole system. Bradley Manning wasn't, at least by the time he was finished, wasn't trying to expose a particular concern he had or bring to light some particular perceived flaw. He was basically, found the U.S. government, I think, to be an awful force in the world and was trying to, so had a much more fundamentally subversive aim. I think that puts a lot of pressure on the model I was describing about how elites have been kind of self-regulated within government for years, because he's so far beyond the pale, actually on two levels. One, in the kind of indiscriminateness of what he leaked, and the lack of regard for kind of the internal norms that are supposed to constrain even those who violate the technical laws on leaking. And two, he is in no sense of the term legal or everyday use authorized to do any of this. He's at a very low level. He's a rogue actor in every respect. So the case is so extreme that I actually kind of wonder if it misleads as a guide to how the government deals with leaking generally. However, I do think it raises these big issues going forward about whether it's helped kind of kick us into a new and maybe more troubling legal paradigm.
And before we go to audience questions, just quickly, a prosecution of Bradley Manning, actually the prosecution of Julian Assange, good thing or bad thing for the system?
That's me?
Yeah, I'm going to ask everybody.
I decline strongly against it. I don't know that I have a very well thought out answer, but I tend to side with, I don't know if people might say Yochai Benkler has a big piece, well-known scholar in this field, about the functional indistinguishability of WikiLeaks from the New York Times. And I tend to think there's a lot to that, and of course you get in the business. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think basically Scott called it a functional system we broke our way towards, where leakers are much more vulnerable than the press. I think that probably strikes a decent balance, at least in the absence of a conspiracy, which doesn't seem to be, to exfiltrate the information, doesn't seem to be proven in Assange's case. I think that the New York Times is kind of very awkwardly situated vis-a-vis WikiLeaks. A bad ruling for WikiLeaks is maybe ominous for the New York Times. In that sense, your natural allies. On the other hand, there's a concern to distance yourself from WikiLeaks, to show the kind of ethic of responsibility that has, in part, been seen to justify the legal latitude that the New York Times operated with for so many years. So I understand. I think it's a very tough case for you guys. I think, anyways, I think it's all kind of academic because of the way things are playing out. But I might guess, informed by no inside info, is that the U.S. government would not have prosecuted Assange, given the backlash that it was.
Scott, important likely prosecution, and how bad would it be? From your perspective, how bad would it be?
I'll talk about both of them. First of all, Bradley Manning, I mean, I agree completely with your analysis of Bradley Manning. I mean, he is not a whistleblower by any stretch of the imagination, neither under the statute nor under the common use of that term. And moreover, as a member of the military who's engaged in this, I think there has to be disciplinary action. There has to be court-martial. It strikes me that that's unavoidable. The big mistake in that case is the demonization and the harsh treatment, which I think were just, what did J. Cronin say, knuckle-headed? Yeah, I think that's exactly what they were, just dumb. And, but Julian Assange is a really different case. I think, I'm not sure exactly what the theory is that would be used here. It seems to me that theory would wind up being something of a stretch under current law in any event, but it just strikes me generally that this would be a public relations disaster for the United States to do. Not a smart thing. You're going to turn him into a martyr in the eyes of people all around the world. That doesn't advantage the United States. And I think the U.S. has already made a number of mistakes in this case with overkill and over-aggressive accusations against him, which he's used very much to his benefit. I mean, if you looked at the asylum decision that was given by Ecuadorian foreign minister consisted of a long recitation of things that were said by public affairs spokesmen of the Department of Defense, by American diplomats, by American political officials, and so on. I was just like listening to the whole, was just stunned at it. So it just seems to me that that would backfire.
So, a question from the audience in the short time we have here. Anybody want to ask anything? There's a question back here.
Microphone, please.
On the subject of leaks, I think we really have to ask the New York Times, how often do you get leaks that are just so egregious from a national security point of view you just step back from? I'm sure you get a lot of boring stuff you just don't want to write about. Does that happen very often? And Scott, what is your preferred way of getting leaked material? Because obviously your phone must be monitored in some way. So is it a common snail mail, or I guess that's a subject to itself. But I believe the State Department did an internal assessment of the damage from WikiLeaks, which of course they did not admit publicly, but I believe it was leaked.
Advising counsel answered just the first question.
If I understood the first question, it was how often do we get something, find something out that we then do not publish because we think we do damaging? You know, it's not rare. I mean, it happens, you know, depending on your, you know, how precise your definition is. You know, maybe in my bureau, it happens a couple dozen times a year that someone finds out something significant that they choose not to put in the newspaper after talking about all, you know, the news value and the potential consequences. And in terms of how I like to get information, I'll tell you what, it is getting, this is actually a very important point that hasn't come up today. It's getting very tough. One theory as to why there have been 6 leak prosecutions is, in I think at least 4 of them, there are email exchanges between reporters and government officials, the defendants, that are, you know, becoming part of the evidence. It takes, you know, the government has the right to look at government email just like anyone's employer can look. And they see a story they don't like in the newspaper, they can take the byline, the reporter's name, plug it into their email system, and you know, 0.003 seconds, have a list of everyone who's exchanged emails with that reporter in the last, you know, 2 months, and then, you know, they're off to the races. So all the discussion earlier about how difficult this crime is to prove and so on is becoming less and less true. So just to be very clear, I like things in brown paper wrapped. 1627 I Street Northwest, Suite 700.
Quick question for Mr. Horton. I was wondering, I was pretty much agree with everything you said. I was really surprised though to hear you characterize Bradley Manning as not a whistleblower. I was wondering if you felt the same way about Daniel Ellsberg. It seems to me, and Mr. Ellsberg said he thought it was pretty hard to distinguish between the two of them.
Yes, he has said that. In fact, I publicly disagreed with him about that once. No, I think a whistleblower is disclosing specific information that he's found that relates to some wrongdoing or something that the public urgently needs to know. And what Bradley Manning was doing was just global. I mean, it was all the confidential cable traffic that he was able to access. He was turning over. So that's really not the sort of filtering and not the sort of motivation that I associate with a whistleblower. I'd say, by the way, the one major unexplored question concerning Bradley Manning is who authorized him to have access to all those cables? And when I see the demonization of Bradley Manning, the constant attacks, I constantly think, somebody doesn't want us to ask and explore certain questions. And I think, you know, the fact that he was given access to those materials is something that is well worth being fully explored because somebody made a major error in judgment. There's a question here. Yes, please.
I think You know, we're getting flavor of the month from a while back, the Valerie Plame case. And I would just like you to speak to the difference between that kind of a leak, which seemed very pointed, to, in fact, do damage to personnel's integrity in terms of their safety and that kind of thing. And the questionable source of that, and then the New York Times' capitulation with that whole deal.
The New York Times, what was the last part? The New York Times is...
Cooperation with, or use of that information, however you want to frame that.
I guess I can address that briefly. Valerie Plame Wilson was, of course, the undercover CIA officer who whose identity, whose employment with the CIA was classified, and who the New York Times and everybody else wrote about, and there was this long-running attempt to find out who was responsible for that ended, as often these inquiries do, with Scooter Libby being prosecuted for perjury. I guess the only thing I would say about that is you do have to be careful on the receiving end, to sort of think about, are you being used in some political way? What is the news value of what's being revealed? Are you inadvertently becoming a tool of some political party or vendetta or whatever?
Last question over here.
Thank you. I think we all agree that the informal use of leaks, however we define it, has worked fairly well for the administrations, at least since the Roosevelt administration during World War II, when they brought publishers into the cabinet and had very, very routine informal meetings with newspapermen, told them things that probably they didn't want published, and then threatened them with prosecution if they were published. But perhaps we've passed the high water mark with some recent statements by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who seems to have reinterpreted the First Amendment and said that retired military personnel, particularly senior military personnel, and former military personnel don't have the right to speak in political context. And there's been really a paucity of any comment from the media about that chilling comment, which I think is really the way that the message is sent in the political world in Washington. People don't get prosecuted. Somebody comes up and puts their arm around your shoulder and say, gee, General, it was nice that you retired. However, if your corporation wants to do business with government, you'll shut up. And we just don't see much except a little piece published in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago.
Well, I'm familiar with some of those cases. They go back now about 5 or 6 years. I think into the middle of the Bush administration, I talked to some of the flag officers, retired flag officers, who were involved. We got phone calls threatening that their pension rights were going to be under review and things like that. No, I think that was a completely outrageous statement. There's no reason why. I think, obviously, serving military officers is one thing, and there they have all sorts of obligations that limit correctly their participation in public debate and public discussion. But once they're retired, they're completely free to speak, and I think they can play a meaningful role in public debate and conversation. And then to use the power of government to silence them is completely outrageous.
Yes. Well, they're not completely legally free. They will all have signed, agreements not to talk about classified material, even post-retirement. And there too, I would just note that almost no civil, even though a number of cases from the late 70s, early 80s established that the government could bring civil lawsuits to enforce those agreements, barring publication of a memoir, seeking damages, money damages for something published. The government has not gone there. But again, we're back to the point of, you put it well, maybe the arm around the shoulder doing the work. I can't really speak to that, but I think it's right that to the extent that there might be chilling going on, it's of the behind-the-scenes flavor in the legal system has once again dropped away. I just wanted to say a quick point on the Valerie Plame thing, which is that that's a very unusual case for the government and legally in the sense that there was a special prosecutor, Patrick Fitzgerald, appointed to run that investigation. Political pressure made it so that the DOJ felt it had to do that. The acting Attorney General, Comey, gave Patrick Fitzgerald under the terms of his writ to investigate the leak, all the authorities of the Attorney General in the matter. That's what it said. That effectively undermined DOJ's longstanding policy, making it very tough to subpoena journalists, because you need the Attorney General's express approval to issue a subpoena to a journalist when the Attorney General is there, and that's not often forthcoming. You also need understanding between that as well. Patrick Fitzgerald, having effective unilateral subpoena authority, subpoenas Judith Miller, Matthew Cooper, other journalists. Judith Miller spent 85 days in jail. That, if anything, I think highlights just how tightly DOJ and the government has self-bound itself in the normal case. It's setting up a system that's unlike the EEO prosecutions, because it shows us what a system that really wants to catch leakers looks like, and it's pretty harsh.
Thank you for that reminder that this conversation started well before the Obama administration, and we're so focused on the present moment. We did a conference at the old center, I think 4 or 5 years ago, on this very topic of secrecy. And I went through the transcript last night, and now that I've listened to today, I want to say we think we're having the same old conversation, but we're not. We're now really looking towards solutions and remedies and where we stand in terms of the interstices between law and policy, actually. So whether you know it or not, we've actually come some distance, which is what the next panel is going to talk about. So get some coffee, get some cookies, and come back. Thank you.